Okay, so today we're going to talk about community structure. So, what do communities look like in ecology? That means where the animals live, the abiotic and the biotic factors they're interacting with. So, what does a community look like? Introduction. Different ecological communities can be pretty different in terms of types and numbers of species they contain. For instance, some Arctic communities include just a few species, while some tropical rainforest communities have huge numbers of species packed into each cubic centimeters. So in the Arctic, there might be only a few different species of plants and animals because not a lot of plants and animals have adapted to live in that icy, cold tundra area. However, in the tropical rainforest, there's a huge contrast with the number of species living so closely together. You can find a species of animals on the ground, in the trees, basically anywhere in the rainforest. One way to describe this different is to say that the communities have different structures. Community structures is essentially the composition of a community. So, what makes it up, including the number of species in that community and their relative numbers. It can also be interpreted more broadly to include all of the patterns of interaction between those different species. So, how are the animals interacting with each other? How are the plants and animals interacting with each other? In this article, we'll look at some of the ways that community structure can be quantified, which means measured numerically. Then we'll examine factors that shape community structure, focusing especially on the foundation and keystone species. So, how do we measure community structure? Two important measures ecologists use to describe the composition of a community are the species richness and their diversity. So, what is species richness? Species richness is the number of different species in a particular community. So, if you take the town that you live in to understand the species richness, you would just take a look at the different animals and plants or different species that are around your area. So you might see squirrels, deer, maybe some geese, maybe some turkeys, some worms. Okay, so that would be the species richness of your community. Communities with the highest species richness tend to be found in areas near the equator, which have lots of solar energy, which supports species' need for energy, warm temperatures, large amounts of rainfall, and little seasonal change. So you can find the most rich communities filled with all these different species in areas that are closer to the equator. So it's warm there, it's consistently warm, it's not going from one extreme to another extreme like we see in Illinois from summer to winter. There's a large amount of consistent rain. Okay, so there's that access to fresh water. There's also access to sunlight, which helps plants grow, that also in turn provides food for the animals. So as you can see, closer to the equator, there's just a really abundance of resources for animals, and that really goes into all the different types of animals that can live in that certain area. Communities with lowest species richness lie near the poles, so the North Pole and the South Pole. So there's less solar energy and it's colder and drier, and there's just less ability to adapt to the harsh change of life there. This pattern is illustrated below for mammalian species or mammals. Many other factors in addition to latitude can also affect a community species richness. So if you guys take a look at the map that's provided for you, as you can see up in the north and the south, so the north of North America and down south in South America, those are shaded light green to almost white, and that that shows that there's really not a great variation or different number of species living there. And you can see how in the center of the map near Central America and Northern South America, how that richness increases and how it kind of goes from that super light green at the poles to a darker green and then to the darkest green in this near the equator. And you can see that's where the majority of the Amazon rainforest is too in South America, where that dark green is. So next we're going to talk about species diversity. Okay, species diversity is a measure of community complexity. It is a function of both the number of different species in the community and their relative abundances. So that's meaning the types of species living in a community and how much of each species can be living in that area. Large numbers of species and even more abundances of species lead to higher species diversity. For example, a forest community with 20 different types of trees would have greater species diversity than a forest community with only 5 types of trees. A forest community with 20 different kinds of trees and even abundances would have a greater species diversity than a forest with the same number of species and in very uneven abundances. So, for example, species diversity, you need to have you need to have an abundance of species and they need to be the same amount. So a less diverse community would have maybe, there would be 20 different types of trees, but maybe there's only 2 of each tree. Whereas an abundant or very diversified community would have perhaps 10 to 20 different kinds of trees, and there's 10 or more of each of them. Okay, so it's not just what types of animals are living in a community, it's how many of those animals are able to survive consistently in those communities. In general, ecologists think that more diverse ecological communities are more stable. So that means that areas or communities that have a large assortment of all different types of species are going to last longer, and they're going to be able to sustain that for a long period of time. However, the diversity-stability relationship isn't a universal rule. And there are some cases where factors besides species diversity are important in determining community and ecosystem stability. So what factors shape community structure? The structure of a community is the result of many interacting factors, both abiotic, living or non-living, and biotic, living organisms. Here are some important factors that influence the community structure. So the climate patterns, okay? Is it warm all the time? Is it warm and humid all the time? Is it a seasonal place? Or are there going to be 4 distinct seasons and you're going to have the animals there experiencing the harsh heat and the harsh cold in the summer and the winter time? The geography of the community, is it on the top of a mountain? Is it in a lush forest? Is it in the Arctic tundra? So where is that location? The heterogeneity. So what is that? So if there is more variation or heterogeneity in a community environment, this may allow for greater species richness because there are more distinct habitats to be occupied. So that means that there's smaller habitats within an entire ecosystem or community. For example, imagine a community occupying a field and another occupying a field with dotted with piles of rocks. The second community may have greater species richness because species that live in the rocks but not in the open field will be present, in addition to those species that live in the field. So the next one is the frequency of disturbances or disruptive events. Okay, so this could be a natural events. This could be a tsunami or a tornado or a mudslide or a landslide, an earthquake, so something natural, or it could be a human disturbance, a human disruption, which could be humans going into the forest and cutting down trees, leveling the land, maybe building a highway through a mountain. Okay, so how many of those disturbances are happening within a community, whether it be human-based or natural, and how are those affecting the animals? And then interactions between organisms. We know that in a community, organisms are constantly interacting both with biotic and abiotic factors. So what do those interactions look like? A community structure can also be shaped by the chance events that happen during its history. For instance, suppose that a single seed blows into the dirt of a particular area. It happens to take root. The species may establish itself and after some period of time become dominant, excluding similar species. If the seed fails to sprout, another similar species may be the lucky one to establish itself and become dominant. Foundation and keystone species. Some species have usually strong impacts on community structure, preserving the balance of a community or making its existence possible. These special species include foundation and keystone species. So let's take a look at what these special species are. A foundation species, so I want you to think of a foundation of like a building. A foundation is a really important part because it holds the entire structure together. If you don't have a good foundation for a building or house, the building or house will crumble or it will not last. So a foundation species is a species that is really holding everything together. Animals live around this species. Often foundation species act by modifying the environment so that it can support the other organisms that form the community. An example is brown algae or kelp. This is a foundation species that forms the basis of kelp forests off the coast of California. Kelp creates an environment that allows the survival of other organisms and make up the kelp forest community. The corals of the coral reef are another foundation species. The exoskeletons of living and dead coral make up most of the reef structure, which protects other species from waves and ocean currents. Beavers, which modify their environment by building dams, can also be seen as a foundation species. So you have a great picture of a foundation species right below that paragraph. That is a picture of the coral reef, and those were listed as one of the foundation species. So what's that saying is that beautiful coral reef right there is providing all these things for that community to even be in existence. Okay, so that community in a coral reef is really made up of whole multitude of different types of organisms. You have different types of fish and crabs. You have sharks there. You have mammals that go there, such as dolphins. So it's a really diverse ecosystem that is alive because of this foundation species known as coral. If the coral were to go away, all those different diverse types of species would cease to exist. So let's go down to keystone species. A keystone species is a species that has a disproportionately large effect on the community structure relative to its biomass or abundance. Okay, so this means that it's a certain type of species that has such a big effect on the community and its survival, even though this one certain species, they might not even have a lot of it. It just might be so important that it's just maybe a few species or a handful of species really help keep the communities moving and alive. Keystone species differ from foundation species in two ways. First, they're more likely to belong to higher trophic levels or to be top predators. They act in more diverse ways than foundation species, which tend to modify their environment. The intertidal sea star, which is found in the northwestern United States, is perhaps the most famous example of keystone species. It is a classic experiment of community ecology. The sea stars were experimentally removed from intertidal zones where they live. So these are tide pools, okay? These sea stars live in areas in tide pools, so when the tide goes in, these sea stars are protected in these kind of tidal pools, or they're submerged in the ocean, and when the tide leaves or goes out, these sea stars live in these little puddles of water, which are surrounded by rocks that are kind of littered all over the beach. They're really cool. When sea stars were present, about 25 species of barnacles and algae were found in the lower part of the intertidal zone, but when they were missing, the mussel population expanded downwards and almost entirely replaced by other species. This type of sharp reduction in diversity or collapse of community structure commonly occurs when a keystone species is removed. So since the starfish was removed, the mussels and the barnacles were just taken over by other species, okay? So they were completely wiped out. So the starfish are a keystone species because the way they interact with their environment allows mussels and barnacles to stay alive and thrive in those areas, which are also helpful for other species that rely on the mussels and the barnacles.